Rev 5 February 7th-10, 2020. Am I better is such a simple phrase, but so very difficult to answer in a manner that is quantifiable. Why? Well, if you are standing on a beach that is strewn with rocks of all sizes from sand to pebbles to boulders and you have removed all the huge boulders, did you clear the beach of all but the sand? What is the weight of what has been removed compared to what is left? Do you calculate the ratio in terms of quantity or in terms of mass? If the latter, then how do you calculate the mass of each object on the beach such that an accurate answer is obtained? I am afraid that the goal is unobtainable and pretty much falls in what my thesis advisor called wishful thinking. I don't want to fall into the trap of just providing an emotive measure of how much better I am by comparing how much I feel better about after, in comparison to before, because it is not very meaningful. So, I elected to summarize in detail the change that took place for me because that is something that is concrete as opposed to being both vague as well as not well defined. Once this has been laid out, I will provide some type of emotive measure for the question that can be seen in the first 3 words of this essay. Before I continue, I'd like to point out that unless stated otherwise, what is presented as valid in this essay is conjecture arrived at through abductive and inductive reasoning applied to the data called my experience. If I do write a statement that was proven with methods that guarantee validity, I will try to remember to indicate that is the case, although as I edit this thing I see I failed to do so in one instance. Also, I need to define terminology in a manner that is well defined. Why is this important? If the word possible was defined as free to be the outcome and free to not be the outcome, without real being required, then anything is possible. If real is required, then anything can be imagined as possible, but anything is possible is false. Obviously, and as seen in my example, well-defined definitions make a huge difference, for seemingly very minor changes in meaning can have a huge impact on what constitutes the set of things that satisfies the definition. Additionally, experience has taught me that you cannot perform meaningful analysis when terminology has multiple meanings because it muddies the analysis. Rather than starting with an all-inclusive list of words that are then defined, I will lay them out as needed, where the first word that needs defined is object. Starting with my first conjecture, I claim for us, the object is our perception of the actual object because we never see all aspects of the actual object, nor do we in general see its aspects without the aspects having been transformed by our mind. With my conjecture taken as valid, I define object so as to indicate this difference as seen below. Let us define object, A, as the actual object. Let us, for n is an element of the natural numbers, define object, n, as our or a perception of object, A. To illustrate why the distinction between object, A, and object, n, is important, think of Joe Smith. Do you see a sense Joe's entire DNA sequence? No, and that is only a very small fraction of the actual object called Joe Smith that you are unaware of. Suppose Joe is seen as a thief by some, then those that perceive Joe in this way will see Joe as object K, or Joe, K. On the other hand, those that know Joe as a fine associate that has never stolen a thing will perceive Joe in a different manner. Let us call this later perception Joe, M. In a sense we have 3 objects, one is the actual object that we are never actually perceiving and the others are perceptions generated in the observer's mind. Even the physical image we have conjured up in our mind is not the actual object, for what is sensed by the eyes and seen reflecting off the object's surface has been transformed in the process that we call sight, and when subjective attributes such as emotive attributes are in some way incorporated into the perception, then, object, N, becomes further from the reality of object, A. I have several more conjectures related to object and they are listed below. 1. Our emotive attitude regarding object, N, is hardwired and cannot be altered by us. 2. Our emotive attitude regarding object, N, is no more taught than the like of sugar is taught to any of us. For example, racial bias is not taught, rather, false portrayals or false attributes are conveyed or taught. However, the emotive attitude called racial bias triggered by the false portrayal is hardwired and not taught. 3. One may be given false attributes regarding an object that until discovered as false lead one to emotively view object A as other than they would. However, the emotive attitude that was generated due to a false portrayal is not taught, rather, it is a piece of your operating system that was hardwired so that you were functional at birth. Even more critical to understanding the change I underwent which led to the question, am I better, is what we need to discuss next. What is this topic? The topic is the nature of the trigger. For a reason that I can place cause on as being our common language is not well defined as well as placing cause on human expectation. Whenever one is observed as suffering from OCD, it is assumed that fear of the trigger is the motivation for the associated behavior. It is also assumed that the feared trigger is seen as capable of doing something demonstrable to the inflicted that is unwanted other than the trigger merely being present, much like the dog is feared due to the bite the dog will inflict. This assumption can be false and seems to be driven by the perception that if A is feared then A must contain something else such as B that is the reason for A being feared. Sometimes the preceding model of fear is true, but if it were required then it follows that there must be an infinite progression of reasons associated with fearing A, such as reason, n-1, is the reason for reason, n-2, which then is the reason for reason, n-3, which is the reason for fear or the emotive attitude directed at A. When reality does not coincide with the assumption, then what we are seeing is simply evolution in its wisdom hardwired the emotive attitude such as fear or aversion directly to A, much like we have like is directly hardwired to the taste of sugar. Additionally, fear may not exactly be the emotive attitude pertaining to the trigger that is at issue because this symbol often is used in a manner that is not well defined and often it also can just be an accompanying emotion. What do I mean? Let us talk about some things that aversion seems to be perhaps a better fit for. A. Let us first think of the smell that is associated with decayed bodies of animals. I have smelled this several times and I can attest that evolution hardwired me to have a very negative emotive reaction or aversion to encountering this smell. Not only does the smell cause me to seal off my airways and place distance between the smell and myself, but I also find the smell simply disgusting and accompanied by a strong uneasy sense. If I were to say I had fear associated with encountering the smell of decay, then in a sense it is true in that I am reasonably sure evolution has hardwired us to trigger fear when encountering the smell of decaying bodies, for in general if one always avoids a killing field one will never be caught up in one and survive to copy. B. Let us now think of a state of being. Let this state of being be, women are inferior to men. It is easy to imagine that any woman that had to live with this state of being as something they could only accept as true and learn to live with would be living in a world where very strong aversion equal to the feeling seen in I can't have is strongly present on a daily basis. This aversion is akin to horror of having, and fear only is associated with this state of being over the prospect of finding the state of being is actually true. Let us now experiment with triggers using our new definitions and the concept of emotions that are not strictly fear being an integral part of or associated with the trigger. Experiment 1 involving a trigger. A. Let an actual dog be my 85-pound dog named Buddy, Mackay, and we will denote Buddy as dog A. B. Let dog 1 be a perception of Buddy as a large unfriendly dog that will bite. C. Let dog 2 be a perception of Buddy as a large friendly dog that will not bite. D. Suppose Joe encounters dog A. This triggers Joe to create a question which is what I encountered dog 1, or is it dog 2? E. The question that was triggered contains two components where one of the two components is true and where the component called dog 1 triggers Joe to have fear. F. Here, in this structure, exposure to dog A must, sooner or later, answer the question that has fear associated with it, where this question was created by Joe upon encountering dog A. G. Suppose exposure to dog A resolved the question by showing Joe that the answer to his question is, I have encountered dog too. H. Given the answer to Joe's question was as indicated, we now have dog A has been disarmed as ultimately triggering fear within Joe simply because exposure to dog A showed that the answer to the created question is, Joe has encountered dog too. Unlike dog 1, Joe does not have fear triggered by dog 2. Hence, Joe does not have fear triggered by dog A from this point onwards because for Joe, dog A is now seen as dog 2. Experiment 2 involving a trigger. A. Let an actual concept be, women are inferior to men, and we will denote this concept as women are inferior to men, A, but for brevity let it be denoted as concept A. B. Let concept 1 be a perception of concept A, where concept A is true. C. Let concept 2 be a perception of concept A, where concept A is imaginary or false. D. Suppose Zoe encounters concept A. This triggers Zoe to create a question which is what I encountered concept 1, or is it concept 2? E. The question that was triggered contains two components where one of the two components is true and where the component called concept 1 triggers Zoe to have fear because Zoe has a strong aversion to concept 1 being valid as the state of being that exists in reality. F. Here, in this structure exposure to concept A, unlike exposure to dog A, cannot sooner or later answer the question that has fear associated with it, where this question was created by Zoe upon encountering concept A. As a matter of fact, exposure to concept A will no more answer Zoe's created question than staring at 5 plus 3 equals 4 will answer whether the statement, as given, is true or false. Additionally, exposure to concept A will no more answer Zoe's created question than staring at 2137 will answer whether or not 2137 is a prime number or not a prime number. G. Exposure to concept A, unlike exposure to dog A, does not resolve the question by showing Zoe that the answer to her question is, I have encountered concept 2. H. Here the answer to Zoe's question was not resolved by exposure to its trigger and we do not now have concept A has been disarmed as ultimately triggering fear within Zoe simply because exposure to concept A does not show that the answer to the created question is, Zoe has encountered concept 2. Hence, Zoe continues to have fear triggered by concept A, because for Zoe, concept A has not become concept 2, nor has it been transformed from concept 1 into concept 2. Comparison between trigger 1 and trigger 2. We should see that although the two structures given by experiment 1 and experiment 2 seem to be essentially the same structure, that they are not. Otherwise, they appear isomorphic, but they are not. What is the difference? Let us carefully examine each structure and locate this difference. Examining experiment 1 shows us that encountering dog A triggered two effects. One effect was the question created in Joe's mind and the other effect is the natural consequent of what by necessity unfolds when Joe encounters dog A. Formal logic tells us placing encountering dog A in place must result in the natural consequent is revealed, and in doing so placing dog A in place also answers Joe's question, which then in this experiment disarmed dog A as a trigger of downstream fear. Examining experiment 2 shows us that encountering concept A triggered one effect. This effect was the question created in Zoe's mind. Here there is not an additional effect that is the natural consequent of what by necessity unfolds when Zoe encounters concept A. Formal logic tells us placing encountering concept A in place cannot result in resolving an answer for Zoe's question, where the question is not which of two outcomes, where one is imagined, must necessarily be produced, rather the question pertains directly to concept A, by being a question of validity regarding concept A. Honestly, we all know that 2137 is a natural number that can be taken as, is a prime number, and we all know that 2137 taken as a prime number triggers the question, is the number taken as being prime true or false? We also know that no amount of staring at what led to the question is going to answer the darn question, but we certainly fell into being a lunkhead when we think every trigger of downstream fear is essentially the same structure as found in experiment 1 and can be disarmed by exposure to the upstream cause of the fear. This author surmises that when ERP is effective, a detailed examination of the precise nature of the structure involved will reveal that in all cases where effective, the structure that involves fear or aversion is isomorphic or essentially the same structure as found in experiment 1. Specifically, this is a structure with cause and effect in which one of the effects can be clearly shown or demonstrated to be false by its cause, much like carrying out the experiment of releasing a ball from one's hand shows as the ball falls and that the ball raises is false. This author also surmises that when ERP fails, the structure that involves fear or aversion is isomorphic to the structure found in experiment 2. Specifically, this is a structure which, when viewed as having a cause and effect, does not let us see the effect is false because the effect is not a consequent made demonstrable by the cause in that it must manifest itself. Rather, it is a question of true or false that pertains to the cause, but is not answered by the cause. Footnote. Interestingly, the topic of the effectiveness of ERP generates, in a sense, a bad taste for me. I remember 21 plus years ago an event from when I had sought help from a clinic run by the psychology department at the University of Albany, which I later attended and successfully acquired a graduate degree in mathematics from. The particular young woman, a student that was assigned to me, certainly believed she was the authority on the subject and saw ERP as proven science that must work, and if it failed it was because the client was in a sense malingering. An argument ensued in which her voice was carefully modulated to convey scorn along with some kind of comment regarding junk directed at my thoughts. Well, I retorted, you are like a drunk driving down the highway. It is only a matter of time before you injure someone with your inflated ego and imprecise reasoning. With that I left. The only reason I mention this footnote is because the nature of triggers is more complex than it appears on the surface, and one that is not equipped with the acquired skills needed to solve subtle puzzles is in a sense doing more harm than good, for after all it took quite a few years before I found the truly effective way of dealing with my issue, and it was not through exposure. As far as the young student from 21 years ago is concerned, she was like a talking head that only parrots what they are told because having a strong ability to reason without being led seems not to be one of their attributes. Additional questions and comments. Can response prevention then not work for a trigger where the fear of an accompanying consequent made demonstrable by its cause, such as a dog bite, is not the type of trigger being feared by the individual having OCD? No, and what do I mean? Ask yourself, what happened in my dog example of the ERP-like technique that allowed the individual, when encountering dog A, to no longer have an episode by perceiving dog A now as dog 2, instead of dog 1? The answer is the object changed. No, not object A, rather object 1, known as our perception of object A, underwent change. How did object 1 change? Simply stated, object 1 changed by being abandoned and replaced with object 2, which is dog A, no longer is seen as an animal that will bite when encountered. Hence, when the trigger is a concept or object, having a hardwired aversion, that does not create an effect made demonstrable by the cause, rather, the effect is one questions whether the concept is true or false, which cannot be answered by exposure. We have to find another way to change the trigger. Changing. Women are inferior to men, 1, where 1 indicates taken as valid. 2. Women are inferior to men, 2, where 2 indicates the concept is taken as imaginary, is exactly the type of change needed, but it cannot be accomplished in the same manner that dog 1 became dog 2, which was through exposure to dog A. Here, you either need to use deductive logic to show the trigger is imaginary, or you need to utilize belief as strong as faith to let you accept as valid that the trigger is imaginary. For example, one can either show through some long drawn-out well-defined process that women are inferior to men, A, is false, which changes women are inferior to men, 1, where 1 indicates the concept is taken as valid, into women are inferior to men, 2, where 2 now indicates the concept is taken as imaginary, or one can simply use belief to accomplish the same end result. Incidentally, as a mathematician that knows more than nothing about probability and classical statistics theory, any attempt to use averages as a definitive answer to answer is the concept from above true or false is just dumb reasoning, because there is no guarantee that any running average pertaining to any human attribute converges. Hence, from a statistical point of view, the concept is not really answerable. Even if averages were in fact definitive, the value attached to any attribute or average is subjective, not objective, hence, the end conclusion is totally subjective. In this case, I highly suggest one does not burn out any brain cells trying to come up with an objective answer and to then just believe in what suits them. If I were a woman and my perception was that the concept was definitive, I would certainly choose to simply believe the concept was false, because being subjective and will lead to looking for an objective answer that does not exist except in one's imagination. I would also strongly resist any attempt to change my emotive response to the concept being valid for two reasons. One reason is I was biologically assembled to oppose changing my emotive attitudes that are directed at perceptions. The other reason is doing so would make it less likely that I object to a dumb man being placed in charge, and all I can say to that idea is unprintable. Again, how can you change the object that triggers or provides the trigger so as to remove it serves as a trigger? If the consequent is made demonstrable by its cause, like the dog bite, then exposure most likely produces the effect, but when the trigger is sufficiently different, such as an aversion to a state of being that is unacceptable for having exist, that provokes the question, is this valid, then you're wasting your time and torturing the client by exposing the client to what triggers his or her emotive response. In this latter case, rather than exposure, one needs to change the object, where here object is one's perception of the object, and if need be utilize denial or belief. For me this occurred when object 1, which was for me emotive views such as bad, wrong, unworthy, stupid, being taken as a being perceived as properties of the object they were associated with, was changed by actually showing object 1 was imaginary and does not exist. This made object 1 transform into object 2, where bad, wrong, unworthy, stupid are emotive attitudes that are triggered and generated within. These emotive attitudes are much like the signal the radio transmitter generates, where these attitudes then are directed at external objects, but not constituent parts of external objects. For me, the transformation of object A, seen as object 1, into now seen as object 2, was precisely the change that was necessary to remove the trigger. Incidentally, I could have been exposed to behaviors described as being of a type matching those shown in my partial list of emotive views until the cows ruled the earth, and it would not have been effective, because I was never fearing a consequent that was demonstrable by its cause. Now let us ask these questions. Can the trigger called the perception of the object I defined as object N always be truthfully changed? If it can be truthfully changed, can it be shown by you to deserve this change in a manner that guarantees certainty? My answer is almost surely, no. Does this then mean we are either stuck with some perception as being an unrelenting trigger, or else we have to do what we are hardwired to strongly resist, which is change our emotive response to object N, defined as our perception? No, denial and belief are strong tools that can be as effective as reality itself in changing one's perception, so if needed then utilize these tools. For example, if we allow denial or belief to be implemented, then an aversion to having a husband that is capable of rape being a possibility, and the associated fear of one day this being discovered as being valid, can be changed through denial or belief simply by believing what you have an aversion to and fear of does not exist for your husband and is not possible. You must also remember not everything is removed from the set of really bothersome by just being unlikely, and if we dig deep enough we can probably find the reader's uniquely specific issue which appeared for many when Ebola was considered as being in a state of being spread. This is why exposure that only shows unlikely but not cannot happen is often not sufficient for changing the perception of the object that serves as the trigger, i.e. it needs to be changed to false, not unlikely, and you have no say in which of the two pertains to you, for this is part of your operating system, not a book you can select to read. If what I outlined above is not common knowledge, I can honestly say that I am not surprised. However, I had to find what I have outlined to in a sense survive, and fortunately for me I like difficult puzzles where the reasoning must be rigorous. Lucky for me I tend to be both persistent and ultimately successful, and had I given up I would not be about to answer, am I better, as a question. An answer for am I better. At this point I walk the reader through my understanding of triggers with respect to OCD and how I see they can be removed, and why I see a specific methodology as being prone to fail when assumed to be suitable for all forms of OCD. I always remember examples such as squaring the largest side of a rectangle may give you its area. Why? Because they show not always the case means we must look for the error within our assumptions and not blame not behaving as expected on the object being addressed. I also touched on what was a major trigger for me and how I disposed of the trigger, but the opening sentence I typed in this essay was, "Am I better?" Well, yes. I am better in the sense that a major trigger has been completely removed, especially since language is subjective, and therefore I can also remove language from my personal vocabulary that suggests emotive attitudes or properties of an object. However, thinking of the beach strewn with rocks that I verbally created in my first paragraph, the major trigger I have removed is like a boulder the size of a house that is no longer present. Sure, I notice the beachscape has changed, but I am still left with all the smaller pebbles and stones and rocks and minor boulders that remain, and perhaps they are easier to see now that the huge boulder no longer is an item of focus. What are these remaining triggers? These remaining triggers are in general related to language, where language is our common language, which often has not been well thought out and often is not being well defined, thus misleading. Additionally, they are unwanted concepts that are often conveyed by another with a voice carefully modulated to convey authority that on the surface seems to hold merit, but that under the microscope amount to intellectual baloney. As I stated before, I see the language issues like the musician hears the sharp note while others don't even notice them. Sometimes my emotive response is strong enough to trigger the OCD quest of the need to remove the preceding with mathematical certainty, hence these are the remaining triggers. In general, if you think of each remaining potential trigger as being a math problem in need of a solution, they are solvable when approached like a math problem. On the other hand, if possible, I try to let belief lead me to accept they are solvable, because solving any puzzle takes time, and doing so while under duress is no fun and quite unpleasant. For belief to work well, I find it is best to not closely examine the trigger when it is only vaguely sensed, otherwise it is harder for belief to work its magic. Interestingly, my emotive being is always spot on. I say this because when I acquire the feeling of can't have it is overwhelming, much like a strong stench that is telling me something yet fully seen has for me a strong aversion. It has never been in error when I allow myself to examine in detail what first provokes the emotion, even when at first it is very sketchy in terms of detail. Its accuracy is much like a savant's ability to place a day of the week to any date. Additionally, I found it was a good idea to keep a fairly secret diary of solutions, because I often forget in its entirety what the issue was once it had been solved. The diary often allows me to quickly refresh what is required to once again vanquish the trigger should it have been forgotten but needed. I can still remember prior to September 11, 1974, when I was about to turn 19 years of age. I don't think I will ever return to when OCD was not part of my life, where OCD means a very strong need to remove from existence something that I simply cannot have be. Somehow that emotive need was acquired or wired into me as my mind was still forming for specific but often hidden things, and it has not been vanquished. Only a very major trigger has been vanquished, and this is why I am better and very, very thankful for the change, but it is not over, and I can't measure in a quantifiable manner the difference because I can still be caught up in it for hours on end. End. Mike Boyer.